Okay guys, so we're going to start our layered portrait edits. We're going to begin with probably the simplest way of doing it. So in response to Lucas Simone's cut through portraits, exactly like the one we've got on screen at the moment. Whilst I'm working, I'm going to leave this one on screen at the same time as a portrait I'm working from. I think that's always a good idea when you're trying to copy an artist's work. So to do that, I'm going to click on Window, Arrange, and select Float All in Windows. So I'm going to have this portrait over here, and then this portrait that I'm going to work on the left-hand side. Okay, I'm going to start by just zooming in a little bit on the portrait. So Control plus to zoom in. And we're going to use the marquee tool here today to select different areas of the portrait to cut out. I'm just going to move that image out of the way a little bit. So the marquee tool is on the left-hand side, and it's this tool here. We're going to select that. The feather is currently set to 1 pixel on the top here. What that means is it will give a slightly soft, very slightly 1 pixel wide blur to it, which I think is about right for most tasks. So I'm going to start, and just like the image on the right, I'm going to start by cutting out some big sections, random shapes from the top image. To do this, we're going to click on the right-hand layer, as we're going to click on the layer palette, click on the layer and right-click, and we're going to select duplicate layer. We're going to do this every time we create a new layer to make sure we've always got our background layer intact. So that one we're not going to cut into, we're just going to cut into copies of it. So I'm going to use my marquee tool now, and I'm going to select random shape just by clicking at different points. I want to make those shapes quite geometric looking. When I get to the end, I double click. If I want to select another section, which I'm going to do now, I hold down Shift key and start selecting again. And then still holding down Shift key, keep selecting the shapes I want to cut out of a picture. Shift key again. Shift again. And I'm going to leave the gaps in the middle quite thin. I keep changing the thickness of them a little bit as I go. And then double click at the end to join up that last one. If at any point you click off and your selection fails, it doesn't matter. You can just restart again. Okay, so I'm going to edit cut or Control X. So edit cut, and it's going to remove that section from the image. Now, because the two images are perfectly aligned, you can't quite see what we've done yet. So I'm going to turn off on the layer palette the bottom image, and you can see where I've cut away from the top one. I'm going to put that back on. Now, what we want to create is this idea that there's layers, layer upon layer upon layer. So we're going to add a shadow effect. So on the layer I've cut out, so making sure I've got that layer selected, you can see me circling it on the right-hand window. I'm going to go down to the bottom of the layer palette and select the button marked FX to add a new layer style. And I'm going to add a drop shadow, which you'll be familiar with from things like PowerPoint and word processing programs. And you can see it's created a shadow underneath that layer, as if we're actually cutting through physical layers of paper. You want the setup something like this. So you want the distance a little further along. That's going to create the shadow more on one side. The spread about here on 12, and the size about there on 29. But you can vary that. So if I increase the size, you'll see the shadow gets a bit wider. If I go too far back, it gets a little bit too sharp. So I think you want it about there. If I increase the spread, you'll see the shadow depth, the darker bit just gets a bit too wide. And the distance just pushes it further and further from that one side. Again, we don't want that too far. I think that looks about right. We can see the shape all the way around, but the shadow is definitely darker on one side. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. So that's our first layer done. Now, what we want to do is move the layers slightly as we go. So I'm going to click on the background layer now, and we're going to repeat the same process, but selecting smaller and smaller sections as we go down. So I'm going to duplicate layer again. So I've got a copy of the layer and then start cutting again using, again, the polygon lasso tool. So I'm going to select. You don't have to be, you can overlap and go into the other areas, but what I'm going to try and create is generally smaller and smaller sections as I cut through. Hold down Shift again. Next section. Remember, they're not going to be perfect sections. They can overlap into the other areas. So what's quite one of the things that's quite nice about his work. Okay, and then cut again, Control X or Edit Cut. We'll cut the image, and then we just go down to apply layer mode, select drop shadow again. I'm going to set, just make sure it's set to make default, and then it'll apply the same shadow every time. So with 2 layers down now, what I'm going to do on this one is click on the move tool, and I'm going to move a layer a little bit. You can either do it by just holding on the image and moving it with the mouse, or you can use your arrow keys to offset it a little bit. And what we want is for each layer to come a little bit more out of alignment as we go down. Okay, back onto the background layer, so select that again on the layer palette. Right click, duplicate layer, and we're just going to keep repeating that process. So again, back onto the polygon lasso tool, and I'm going to cut increasingly small sections out. Shift key again. Double click to join up that last section. Okay, and then Control X, Edit Cut again, remove that bit of the image, and then we just apply the same drop shadow. Again, click on the move tool, and we're going to move it. The more we shift it, the more distorted the image becomes. So the harder it gets to read. You can click on any one of the other layers and move those at any point in time as well. Okay, and then we just go back again onto the bottom layer, duplicate layer, back to the Marquee tool, start clicking and cutting. Okay, Control X, cut, top shadow, click OK, and then move that layer as well. And we can keep going up to 10 layers. Obviously, the more you move them, the more distorted it gets. The more layers you put on it, the more distorted it gets. I would aim to get at least 6 layers onto it. Well done if you've got this far so far, guys. Don't forget, when you finish your image, click on File, Save As. Make sure you're saving it to the right area. And just as with all the previous edits, save it as a Photoshop file. And then again, save it as a JPEG file afterwards. So you've got a flattened version and a version with layers as well. Right. Once we've done this one, we're going to move on to some increasingly complicated versions of it. So if you finish this edit, or you finish a couple of edits like this, then click on the next tutorial and watch how to do a more complicated version of. Well done, guys. Save your work as soon as you're ready.